The door clicked shut behind him, and in that single, irreversible moment everything changed. What seemed like a simple act of human decency, helping a frail, struggling elderly woman carry her groceries through the rain-soaked streets, had just sealed his fate in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. But here's what he didn't know as that lock engaged. The trembling grandmother he'd just assisted wasn't helpless at all. She was a decorated KGB operative with over 30 years of field experience, and that quaint little house with the flower boxes and lace curtains. It was a meticulously designed safe house, a psychological trap engineered with surgical precision to capture, disorient, and extract information from men exactly like him. This wasn't random. This wasn't luck. For months, he had been watched, studied, his routines memorized, his vulnerabilities catalogued. Every coffee shop he frequented, every route he walked, every person he spoke to, all of it fed into a profile that made him the perfect target. The KGB didn't just want information. They wanted to demonstrate that even in the heart of the West, even among ordinary citizens, no one was beyond their reach. That house had seen others before him, men who entered through kindness and left broken, if they left at all. But what made him special? What secrets did he possess that justified such an elaborate operation? And more haunting than anything else, when he finally walked out of that door weeks later, was it because he escaped, or because they had already taken everything they needed? This is the story of one man's descent into a nightmare hiding behind a grandmother's smile, a story of Cold War espionage at its most insidious, where the deadliest traps were built not with weapons, but with trust. How did it begin? How did it end? And what did he discover about himself in that house that he can never forget? The rain came down in sheets that November afternoon in Vienna, turning the cobblestone streets into mirrors that reflected a grey, uncertain world. Michael Harrison pulled his coat tighter as he hurried along Maria Hilfer Strasse, already late for a meeting that, in hindsight, probably saved his life, at least for a few more hours. Michael was 43 years old, a technical consultant for an American telecommunications company with European contracts. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would attract attention. He lived in a modest apartment in the 7th District, spoke passable German, and had settled into the comfortable anonymity that Vienna offered to expats who minded their own business. His routine was predictable: morning coffee at Café Sperl, work at the office near Stephansplatz, evening walks along the Danube Canal, and weekends exploring the museums he never seemed to tire of. Vienna in 1983 was a city of shadows and whispers. Officially neutral, it had become the espionage capital of Europe, where East met West in a dangerous dance of intelligence gathering. The Americans had their people, the Soviets had theirs, and everyone pretended not to notice the watchers in the cafes and the listeners in the hotel lobbies. Michael knew this, of course. Everyone did. But he had convinced himself it didn't concern him. He was just a telecommunications guy. He installed phone systems. Nothing exciting, nothing classified, nothing worth a second glance from either side. That's what he told himself anyway. The rain had driven most people indoors, so when he saw her struggling on the corner of Neuburgasse, she stood out like a painting in an empty gallery. An elderly woman, perhaps in her 70s, thin and bent against the weather, desperately trying to manage 2 heavy shopping bags while her umbrella threatened to turn inside out with every gust of wind. Vegetables were spilling from one torn bag, rolling across the wet pavement, potatoes, onions, a cabbage that had split open against the curb. Michael didn't hesitate. It wasn't heroism, just basic human decency, the kind his mother had drilled into him growing up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. You help people who need help. It's that simple. "Ma'am, let me help you with those," he called out, already moving toward her, his own umbrella raised. She looked up at him and he saw what he expected to see: an old woman's face, lined with age and exhaustion, eyes watery behind thick glasses, a scarf wrapped around thinning grey hair. Relief washed over her features. "Oh, bless you, young man," she said in German, her voice quavering and weak. "I don't know what happened. The bag just tore and everything—" She gestured helplessly at the scattered groceries. "It's no problem at all," Michael assured her, already gathering the escaped vegetables, noting how heavy the bags were. Too heavy, really, for someone her age to be carrying alone. "Do you live nearby? I can help you get these home." She hesitated, or seemed to hesitate, and Michael would replay that moment 1,000 times later, analyzing every micro-expression, every slight pause that he had interpreted as elderly uncertainty, but might have been calculation. Might have been an actress hitting her mark perfectly. "Just a few blocks," she finally said, pointing down a side street that led away from the main thoroughfare. "I hate to trouble you, but my arthritis, the rain makes it so much worse." "To no trouble at all," Michael said, taking both bags despite her weak protests. They were indeed heavy, filled with basic staples: potatoes, bread, canned goods, flour. The shopping of someone who planned to be home for a while. They walked slowly, the old woman setting the pace with her careful, shuffling steps. She chatted as they went, and her story came out in fragmented pieces, exactly as you'd expect from an elderly person speaking to a kind stranger. Her name was Frau Adler. She'd lived in Vienna her whole life. Her husband had died 10 years ago. Her son lived in Munich and rarely visited. She managed on her own, but days like this, with the rain and her aching joints, reminded her that she wasn't as young as she used to be. It was all perfectly ordinary, perfectly believable. And Michael, kind-hearted Michael, who still called his own mother every Sunday, felt genuinely sorry for her. "This is it," she said finally, stopping in front of a narrow 3-story building painted a fading yellow. It looked like a dozen other residential buildings on the quiet street, old but maintained, with flower boxes in the windows and a well-swept entrance. The ground floor had lace curtains, and through them Michael could see what looked like a cozy sitting room with old furniture and framed photographs on the walls. "Let me help you get them inside," Michael offered, already moving toward the entrance. Again that hesitation, that perfect, practiced hesitation that suggested reluctance born of propriety rather than calculation. "Well, if you're sure you don't mind," Frau Adler said, producing a key from her coat pocket. "Just inside the door would be wonderful. I can manage from there." The key turned smoothly in the lock, too smoothly perhaps for such an old building. The door opened into a small vestibule with stairs leading up, and a door to the right leading to what was presumably her ground-floor apartment. The smell hit him immediately, not unpleasant, just distinctive. Old furniture, cooking odors, the mustiness of a place where windows weren't opened often enough. The smell of an elderly person living alone. Except, "Just through here," Frau Adler said, opening the inner door and stepping aside to let him pass with the heavy bags. Michael stepped across the threshold into a parlor that looked exactly as he'd glimpsed through the window. Worn but comfortable furniture, doilies on the side tables, a television in the corner, photographs on every surface. Photographs of a life lived. A younger Frau Adler, with a stern-looking man who must have been her husband, pictures of a boy growing up, family gatherings, holidays. He set the bags down on a small table near the kitchen doorway, already preparing his polite exit lines. That's when he heard it. The softest sound, barely perceptible under the rain pattering against the windows, the click of the door lock engaging behind him. Not the simple turn of a key, but something mechanical, something automatic. Michael turned back toward the entrance, suddenly alert in a way he couldn't quite explain. Frau Adler was still there, standing by the door, but something had changed. Her posture, perhaps, the way she held herself. The trembling had stopped. "Thank you so much for your help," she said, and her voice was different too, still speaking German but clearer now, stronger. The quaver was gone. "Of course," Michael said slowly, his instincts screaming at him now, though he couldn't yet articulate why. "I should be going. My meeting in just a moment," Frau Adler interrupted gently. "Please sit, have some tea. It's the least I can offer after you've been so kind." It wasn't really a request. And when Michael looked at her again, really looked, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Her eyes, behind those thick glasses, were sharp, alert, watching him with an intensity that had nothing to do with elderly gratitude and everything to do with assessment, professional assessment. "I really should go," Michael said, keeping his voice calm, already moving toward the door. "I'm afraid that won't be possible just yet, Mr. Harrison," Frau Adler said. And now she removed her glasses entirely, revealing eyes that were not watery or dim at all. They were the eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime reading people, manipulating them, breaking them. "We have so much to discuss, and you've been so very difficult to get alone." She knew his name. This wasn't random. This was never random. Michael's hand was on the doorknob now, turning it, pulling. The door didn't budge. He tried again, harder, and felt the resistance of serious locks, the kind that didn't belong in an old woman's apartment, the kind that were designed to keep people in, not out. "What is this?" he demanded, turning back to face her, adrenaline flooding his system now, his mind racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Frau Adler, if that was even her real name, moved to a chair and sat down with the fluid grace of someone decades younger than she appeared. She was still an older woman, he could see that now, but there was nothing frail about her. The trembling hands were steady, the stooped posture had straightened. She looked at him with something that might have been sympathy or might have been professional satisfaction. "This, Mr. Harrison, is the consequence of being interesting to the wrong people," she said calmly. "Please sit down. Fighting will only make this more difficult, and we both know you're not trained for physical confrontation. Your skills lie elsewhere, don't they?" Michael's mind raced. What skills? He was a telecommunications technician. He installed phone systems for corporations. There was nothing in his background, nothing in his work, that should have attracted this kind of attention. Unless, oh God, unless they knew about the other thing. The thing he'd promised himself was just helping out, just a favor, nothing serious. The thing he'd told himself wasn't really betraying anyone because he wasn't really an asset, just someone who occasionally answered questions, provided technical advice, noticed things and mentioned them to a contact who bought him dinner once a month. The CIA had promised him it was nothing dangerous. Low-level information gathering. Technical consultations about Soviet communication systems based on his knowledge of European telecommunications infrastructure. Nothing that would ever put him at risk. They had lied, or he had been compromised, or both. "I don't know what you think I am," Michael began, but Frau Adler raised one hand, silencing him with a gesture that held authority earned over decades. "We'll get to what you are soon enough," she said. "For now, understand that you are in a safe house that has served the interests of the Soviet Union for over 20 years. This house has hosted many guests like yourself, Mr. Harrison. Some cooperated quickly, some took longer. All of them eventually understood that the only way forward was through honest conversation." "And if I refuse to talk?" Michael asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She smiled then, and it was not unkind. That was somehow worse than if she'd threatened him. "Then we will wait and talk anyway, and eventually you will realize that refusing serves no purpose except to prolong your stay. We are not monsters, Mr. Harrison. We are professionals. We want information, nothing more. Give us what we need, and you will walk out that door. Refuse and, well, Vienna is a large city. People disappear. Others take their place. Life continues." Michael looked around the room again, seeing it differently now. The photographs were still there, but now he wondered if any of them were real. The comfortable furniture remained comfortable, but now he noticed how the chairs were positioned, always facing inward, always observable from multiple angles. The windows had curtains, but he could see now that they were heavier than they appeared, likely soundproofed, certainly preventing anyone outside from seeing in clearly. How many men had sat where he was sitting? How many had walked through that door with compassion in their hearts and terror in their future? "We have time," Frau Adler said, standing and moving toward the kitchen. "I'll make that tea. You'll find that while your situation is serious, it need not be unpleasant. We can be civilized about this. After all, we're all professionals here, aren't we?" She disappeared into the kitchen, leaving him alone in the parlor, the locked door behind him, the rain still falling outside, and the terrible understanding settling over him like a shroud. He had walked willingly into a trap that had been months in the making, baited with nothing more sophisticated than human kindness. And the most terrifying part? They had studied him well enough to know that kindness would work. Now, if you want to know how Michael navigated this nightmare, if you want to discover what the KGB truly wanted from him, and how this seemingly simple telecommunications consultant became the target of such an elaborate operation, then make sure you subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button, leave a comment below telling us what you would have done in Michael's situation, and share this video with anyone who loves real stories of espionage and survival. Because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about Cold War intelligence operations. What secrets was Michael really keeping? And could anyone truly escape once the KGB had you in their web? The tea arrived on a silver tray, served in delicate porcelain cups with matching saucers that looked like they belonged to someone's actual grandmother. Frau Adler poured with steady hands, added a precise amount of sugar to her own cup, and offered Michael the small pitcher of milk with the casual hospitality of any elderly Viennese woman entertaining an unexpected guest. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on Michael. He was effectively a prisoner, locked in a KGB safehouse, being served tea by a woman who moments ago had dropped her entire elderly invalid persona like an actress stepping off stage. And yet here they sat in a cozy parlor, with rain pattering against the windows and the domestic ritual of afternoon tea playing out as if this were the most normal thing in the world. "You're not drinking," Frau Adler observed, sipping her own tea with apparent enjoyment. "It's not poisoned, Mr. Harrison. What would be the point? We need you conscious and communicative." Michael had been staring at his cup, untouched on the small table beside his chair. He was calculating odds, considering options, running through everything he knew about hostage situations and intelligence operations, which, he was rapidly realizing, wasn't nearly enough. "Who are you?" he asked finally. "Your real name?" She considered the question, tilting her head slightly as if deciding how much truth to offer. "Names are fluid in this profession, Mr. Harrison. Today I am Frau Adler. Tomorrow I may be someone else, but you can call me Katerina if it makes you more comfortable. It's as real as any name I've used. And this house has been operational since 1962, Katerina said, settling back in her chair with the satisfaction of someone discussing a long successful business. The previous occupant, the real previous occupant, was indeed an elderly widow named Adler. She died. We made certain arrangements with the housing authority and her apartment became something else. To the neighbors, I am still Frau Adler, the quiet old woman who keeps to herself. I've played this role for 7 years now. I know everyone on this street. I attend the neighborhood Christmas gatherings. I complain about the noise from the upstairs tenants. I am invisible in my visibility. Michael's throat was dry, but he still didn't reach for the tea. "How many others have you brought here?" 16, Katerina answered without hesitation. "You are the 17th. Some were smaller operations, low-level assets who needed gentle persuasion to continue their cooperation. Others were more significant. There was a NATO communications officer in 1978 who sat in that very chair for 3 weeks before he understood that his silence was pointless. A West German intelligence analyst in 1980, an American embassy clerk in 1981 who had access to code room materials. Each one thought they had been careful. Each one believed they wouldn't be discovered. Each one learned otherwise. "What happened to them?" Katerina's expression didn't change. "That depends entirely on their level of cooperation, Mr. Harrison. The ones who understood the situation quickly, who provided the information we needed and demonstrated their willingness to continue being useful. They walked out that door and resumed their lives, albeit with new arrangements and new obligations. The ones who resisted—" She left the sentence unfinished, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. Michael's mind was racing through his own situation, trying to understand what they could possibly want from him. His work was technical, mundane even. He had access to telecommunications infrastructure, sure, but nothing classified. His occasional consultations with his CIA contact had been so low-level that he'd convinced himself they barely counted as intelligence work at all. "I think you've made a mistake," Michael said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm not important enough to justify this kind of operation. I'm a telecommunications consultant. I install phone systems." Katerina smiled, and there was genuine amusement in it. "Mr. Harrison, do you know how long we've been watching you?" 9 months. Since February, when you first began your little arrangement with David Chen from the American Embassy. Did you think we wouldn't notice? Did you think your monthly dinners at Trzesnevsky, always on the second Tuesday, always lasting exactly 90 minutes, went unobserved? The name hit Michael like a physical blow. David Chen, his contact. The man who had recruited him so casually over drinks one night, who had made it all seem so inconsequential. Just answer a few technical questions now and then. Share observations about the communication systems you work on. Nothing dangerous, nothing that would ever come back to haunt you. It's patriotic, really. You're helping your country. We photographed every meeting, Katerina continued, reaching into a drawer in the side table and producing a folder. She opened it, spreading a series of photographs across the coffee table between them. There was Michael, clear as day, sitting with Chen at various restaurants and cafes across Vienna. The images were professional quality, taken with telephoto lenses from concealed positions. In some, Michael was leaning in, clearly engaged in serious conversation. In others, he was examining documents that Chen had brought. "You were never subtle, Mr. Harrison," Katerina said, not unkindly. "You thought you were being careful, but careful in espionage requires training you don't have. Every time you met Chen, we documented it. Every route you took to those meetings, we mapped. Every phone call you made to his office, we recorded. We know everything about your arrangement with American intelligence. The question now is what else you know that might be valuable to us." Michael felt the walls closing in, metaphorically and literally. The room suddenly seemed smaller, the air thicker. His worst fear was confirmed. He had been compromised, thoroughly and completely, and everything Chen had promised about security and protection had been a lie. "I don't know anything valuable," Michael insisted, hearing the desperation creeping into his own voice and hating it. "The information I gave Chen was basic technical data about commercial telecommunication systems. Nothing classified, nothing military, nothing that matters." "Let us be the judge of what matters," Katerina said, gathering the photographs and returning them to the folder. "You have expertise in communications infrastructure, Mr. Harrison. You understand how systems are built, how they can be accessed, how they can be compromised. You've worked on contracts for major European corporations, including several that have connections to NATO operations. You've been inside facilities that most civilians never see, and you've been feeding selected information to the CIA for 8 months. All of that makes you very interesting to us." She stood, moving to the window and adjusting the heavy curtain slightly, checking the street outside with the practiced vigilance of a professional. Michael watched her, noting the efficiency of her movements, the constant awareness. This was no amateur operation. This was a woman who had spent decades in the field, who had survived when others hadn't, who knew exactly what she was doing. "The Americans used you," Katerina said, still looking out at the rain. "They dangled the illusion of importance in front of you, made you feel like you were serving your country, but they didn't protect you. They didn't give you the training to spot surveillance. They didn't provide you with proper security protocols. They treated you as disposable, Mr. Harrison, a low-level asset who could be burned without consequence if necessary." "And you're different?" Michael asked, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. Katerina turned back to face him, and for a moment there was something almost like respect in her eyes. "No," she said simply. "We're not different. We use people just as ruthlessly. But at least I'm being honest about it. I'm not pretending this is patriotism or duty. This is business. You have information we want. We have leverage you can't escape. The transaction is simple and clean. And if I refuse to talk, then we wait," Katerina said, returning to her chair. "This house is designed for patience, Mr. Harrison. The neighbors know I'm an old woman who keeps odd hours, who sometimes has family visiting. The walls are soundproofed, the locks are specialized, the windows are reinforced. No one will hear you if you shout. No one will rescue you if you wait for help. Your office will receive a phone call tomorrow from you, explaining that a family emergency has called you back to the States suddenly. Your apartment will be cleared out quietly. Within a week it will be as if you never existed in Vienna at all." Michael felt panic rising in his chest, threatening to overwhelm the rational part of his mind that was still trying to find a way out of this. "People will look for me. The embassy will assume you were a low-level asset who panicked and ran," Katerina interrupted. "It happens more often than you'd think. Assets get scared, they break contact, they disappear. The CIA will write you off as a loss and move on. They have bigger concerns than one telecommunications consultant who couldn't handle the pressure." The terrible thing was, Michael knew she was probably right. Chen had never given him emergency protocols or escape plans. There was no cavalry coming to rescue him. He was alone in this room with a woman who had done this 16 times before, and she was very good at her job. "What do you want to know?" Michael asked finally, the words tasting like defeat in his mouth. Katerina's expression softened slightly, and she leaned forward. "There, you see, that wasn't so difficult. We want everything, Mr. Harrison. We'll start with your work for the Americans. Everything you told them, everything you observed, everything they asked about. Then we'll move on to your technical knowledge, the systems you've worked on, the vulnerabilities you've identified. And finally, we'll discuss your future cooperation. Because this doesn't end with one conversation. Once you start talking to us, you become our asset, not theirs. You'll return to your life, but it will be a life we control, feeding information to us instead of to them. Do you understand?" Michael understood perfectly. They weren't just interrogating him. They were flipping him, turning him from a CIA asset into a KGB double agent. And once that happened, there would be no going back. He would be trapped between two intelligence services, always watched, always compromised, always one mistake away from exposure and destruction. But what choice did he have? The door was locked. The room was secure. Katerina had done this 16 times before. And somewhere in Vienna, life was continuing normally. People hurrying through the rain, cafes filling with the after-work crowd, couples making dinner plans, while he sat in this parlor that was really a prison, facing a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. "I need time to think," Michael said weakly. "Of course," Katerina agreed, standing and smoothing her skirt. "The bedroom is through there. It's comfortable enough. There's a bathroom attached, though I should tell you the windows are sealed and reinforced. Don't waste energy trying to break them. Others have tried. Dinner will be at 7. I'm actually quite a good cook, despite what you might think about Soviet cuisine. We'll talk more then. For now, rest. Process what's happening. Come to terms with your new reality." She moved toward the kitchen, then paused at the doorway. "Mr. Harrison, I've done this long enough to recognize the ones who will ultimately cooperate and the ones who won't. You will. You're not built for martyrdom. You're a practical man who values his own survival. There's no shame in that. In fact, it's the quality that will keep you alive. Think about that while you rest." Then she was gone, leaving Michael alone in the parlor with his untouched tea and his spiraling thoughts. He stood slowly, moving to the window and looking out at the street beyond. From here, freedom was only a few meters away, separated by glass and locks and walls that might as well have been an ocean. He could see people passing by, oblivious to the drama unfolding inside this ordinary-looking building. A woman with 2 children hurried past, clutching their hands. A man walked his dog, pausing to let the animal sniff at a lamppost. An elderly couple shared an umbrella, moving slowly but companionably down the sidewalk. Normal life, continuing without him, already leaving him behind. Michael pressed his hand against the glass, feeling how cold it was, how solid, how completely it separated him from the world he'd known just an hour ago. In the kitchen, he could hear Katerina moving about, the sounds of domestic preparation. It was surreal, nightmarish in its normalcy. She would cook dinner. They would eat. They would talk. And somewhere in that conversation, he would begin the process of betraying everything he'd thought he stood for, or he would resist and face consequences he couldn't fully imagine. But that terrified him nonetheless. What would you do watching this story unfold? Would you cooperate immediately to save yourself, or would you resist, hoping against hope that somehow rescue would come? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We genuinely want to know how you'd handle being trapped between superpowers with no good options. Because Michael's situation is about to get even more complicated in ways he cannot yet imagine. The house holds secrets beyond Katerina, and Michael is about to discover he's not the only prisoner here. Michael didn't sleep that first night, though the bedroom Katerina had indicated was, as promised, surprisingly comfortable. A double bed with clean sheets, a nightstand with a reading lamp, a small writing desk by the sealed window. If you ignored the reinforced glass and the lock on the outside of the door, which he had heard engage after Katerina bid him good night, it could have been any modest guest room in any apartment in Vienna. But Michael couldn't ignore those things. He lay on top of the covers, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of how thoroughly his life had unraveled in the span of a few hours. The dinner had been exactly as Katerina promised. She was indeed a good cook, serving a surprisingly excellent Wiener Schnitzel with potato salad, and their conversation had remained almost cordial, focused on neutral topics. She had asked about his childhood in Iowa, his education, his decision to work abroad. It felt like a normal conversation with a normal person, which made it all the more disturbing. She was profiling him, of course, gathering psychological data, looking for vulnerabilities, building a map of who he was and how best to manipulate him. Michael knew this intellectually, but knowing it didn't make it any less effective. Katerina was a master at her craft, with decades of experience in reading people and exploiting their weaknesses. As pale morning light began filtering through the sealed window, Michael heard movement in the apartment. Footsteps, but not just Katerina's. Other sounds, muffled but distinct. Voices, perhaps. Or was his mind playing tricks on him, manufacturing hope where none existed? The lock clicked and the door opened. Katerina stood there, dressed differently now. More casual, more contemporary, the elderly widow persona partially set aside for something closer to her real age, which Michael guessed was early 60s. She was still formidable, still in complete control, but the theatrical frailty was gone. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," she said. "I trust you rested?" The question was rhetorical. She knew perfectly well he hadn't slept. "There are others here," Michael said. It wasn't quite a question. Katerina's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Approval, perhaps, that he'd been observant enough to notice. "Yes, you didn't think you were special, did you? This house serves multiple purposes. Come, breakfast is ready, and there's someone I'd like you to meet." Michael followed her back to the parlor, noting details he'd missed in yesterday's stress and confusion. The apartment was larger than it initially appeared, with corridors leading to additional rooms. The layout didn't quite match the building's external dimensions, suggesting walls had been moved or spaces reconfigured. This wasn't just a safe house, it was a facility. In the dining area adjacent to the kitchen, a small table had been set for 3, and sitting at it, looking haggard but composed, was another man. Mid-30s, dark hair, the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who hadn't been sleeping well for longer than one night. "Mr. Harrison, this is Thomas Wright," Katerina said with the casual courtesy of a hostess introducing dinner guests. "Thomas has been our guest for 2 weeks now. I thought it might be helpful for you two to meet. Sometimes understanding comes easier from a peer than from an adversary." Thomas looked up at Michael, and in his eyes Michael saw resignation mixed with something else. Was it pity or warning? "British?" Michael asked, catching the accent in the way Thomas said a quiet, "Hello." "London," Thomas confirmed. "Was attached to the British Council here in Vienna," was being the operative word. "Thomas works in cultural affairs," Katerina said, serving coffee with the same domestic efficiency she'd shown with the tea yesterday. Or rather, he claimed to work in cultural affairs. In reality, he was MI6, gathering intelligence under cultural attaché cover. Not particularly sophisticated cover, I'm afraid, but it served its purpose for a time. Michael sat down slowly, accepting the coffee but watching Thomas carefully. 2 weeks, she said, "and you're still here." "Still here," Thomas agreed, his voice flat. "Still talking, still trying to figure out if cooperation will actually lead to release, or if that's just another layer of the game." "It will lead to release," Katerina said firmly, joining them at the table with her own coffee. "But only when I'm satisfied that you've provided everything useful and that you understand your new obligations. Thomas has been—" She paused, considering her words, "resistant. Understandably so. He was better trained than you, Mr. Harrison. MI6 actually prepares their people for situations like this. The Americans, as you've discovered, are less thorough with their low-level assets." "You're trying to flip him," Michael said, understanding dawning. "Turn him into a double agent." "Successfully flipped, actually," Katerina corrected. "Thomas agreed to those terms 3 days ago. Now we're in the verification phase, cross-referencing his information, ensuring he hasn't fed us false intelligence. It's tedious but necessary. Trust, as they say, must be earned." Thomas met Michael's eyes across the table, and Michael saw the truth there. The man had broken. He'd given them whatever they wanted, and now he was living in the limbo of waiting to see if his cooperation would truly buy his freedom, or if he'd simply traded one form of imprisonment for another. "Why are you showing me this?" Michael asked Katerina. "Is this supposed to encourage me, seeing what happens to people who cooperate?" "It's supposed to illustrate reality," Katerina replied calmly. "Thomas represents the path of eventual cooperation, but let me show you the alternative." She stood and gestured for Michael to follow. They left Thomas at the table. He barely seemed to register their departure, and Katerina led Michael down a corridor he hadn't been in before. She stopped at a door, this one more substantial than the others, with a serious lock mechanism. "This room is soundproofed more thoroughly than the rest of the house," Katerina explained, producing a key. "We use it for guests who prove more difficult." She opened the door, and Michael's stomach dropped. The room was small, perhaps 3 meters by 4, with bare walls painted institutional grey. There was a narrow bed, a bucket, and nothing else. No window, not even a sealed one. A single bare bulb in the ceiling provided harsh, constant light. And sitting on the bed, looking up as the door opened, was a man who might have been any age between 30 and 50. The kind of timeless exhaustion that stress and fear create. "This is Dmitri," Katerina said. "He's been with us for 6 weeks. Dmitri worked for a Soviet trade delegation, but was passing information to the Americans. When we discovered this, we brought him here. Dmitri has refused to cooperate in any meaningful way. He's maintained that he has nothing to tell us despite evidence to the contrary, so Dmitri stays in this room with his thoughts and his silence while we wait for him to understand that his resistance is pointless." Michael stared at the man, at Dmitri, and saw something that terrified him more than threats or violence: emptiness. The man's eyes were vacant, his spirit clearly broken by weeks of isolation and psychological pressure. He didn't speak, didn't react, just looked at them with the dull acceptance of someone who had given up hope, but couldn't quite surrender. "We don't torture, Mr. Harrison," Katerina said, closing the door again, shutting Dmitri back into his grey limbo. "That's important for you to understand. We don't need to. Isolation, uncertainty, the slow erosion of hope, these are far more effective than physical pain. The mind breaks long before the body does. Dmitri will eventually talk. They always do, but he's making it so much harder on himself than necessary." They returned to the dining area, where Thomas still sat with his coffee, staring at nothing. Michael understood now why the man looked so haunted. He'd seen that room too. He'd understood what the alternative to cooperation looked like. "How many?" Michael asked quietly. "How many people are you holding here right now?" "It varies," Katerina said, sitting back down and refilling her coffee cup as if they'd just returned from checking the weather rather than viewing a man's psychological destruction. "Right now, 3, including you. Sometimes more, sometimes fewer. This house is one of several such facilities we maintain in Vienna. The city's neutrality makes it ideal for our purposes. Everyone spies here, but everyone also pretends not to notice each other's operations. It's a very civilized arrangement." Michael looked at Thomas, who finally met his gaze again. "How long did you resist?" Michael asked him. Thomas laughed bitterly. 10 days. I told myself I was strong enough, that I'd been trained for this, that MI6 would realize I'd been compromised and extract me somehow. Every day I expected rescue. Every night I told myself I'd hold out just one more day. On the 10th day I saw that room, Dmitri's room, and I understood that no one was coming. That I could either cooperate and have some chance at survival, or I could end up like him, losing pieces of myself bit by bit, until there was nothing left worth saving. "And now?" Michael asked. "Now I wait," Thomas said. "I've told them everything I know, identified my contacts, explained my operational protocols, detailed every piece of intelligence I gathered over 18 months in Vienna, and I wait to see if they'll actually release me, or if I've just bought myself a more comfortable cell until they decide I'm no longer useful." Katerina sipped her coffee, unmoved by Thomas's existential crisis. "You'll be released, Thomas, I keep my promises. Once we've verified your information and established your communication protocols for future cooperation, you'll return to London. You'll maintain your cover, continue your work, and periodically provide us with information. If you do this well, you may even advance in your career. After all, MI6 will never suspect that one of their successfully exfiltrated agents has been compromised. From their perspective, you'll simply be someone who was captured and then escaped. A hero, even. A traitor, Thomas corrected quietly. Semantics, Katerina dismissed. Everyone in this business betrays someone eventually. The only question is whom you betray and how much you get in return. Michael's mind was reeling, trying to process the implications of what he was seeing. This wasn't just about extracting information from one telecommunications consultant. This was a systematic operation, running multiple sources, flipping multiple agents, creating a network of compromised intelligence assets across Western agencies. How many others had passed through this house? How many were out there now, back in their positions, reporting dutifully to their services, while also feeding information to the KGB? You still haven't told me what specifically you want from me, Michael said, trying to regain some sense of control over the conversation, even though he knew it was an illusion. Everything, Katerina said simply. Your work with the Americans, as I said yesterday, but also your technical expertise. You've installed communication systems in NATO facilities, corporate offices with government contracts, research institutions working on classified projects. You may think you were just stringing cables and configuring switches, but you saw layouts, security systems, access protocols. You understand vulnerabilities that we can exploit. And once you've provided all of that, you'll continue your work, but with new awareness. You'll look for specific things we need. You'll create access points we can use. You'll become not just a source, but an active participant in our intelligence gathering. I'm not a spy, Michael protested weakly. You've been a spy for 8 months, Katerina countered. You just didn't think of yourself that way because you were working for your own side. But the fundamental action is the same. You gather and transmit information that should remain confidential. The only difference now is which flag that information serves. And frankly, Mr. Harrison, flags are just colored cloth. They matter far less than survival. Thank you so much for staying with this story up to this point. Your dedication means everything, and I promise you, the most intense revelations are still to come. We're just scratching the surface of how deep this operation truly goes, and what Michael discovers next will change everything you think you know about his situation. Keep watching, because the psychological game is about to become far more complex. The days began to blur together in ways that Michael recognized as deliberate. Katerina was manipulating time itself, disrupting his circadian rhythms with irregular sleep schedules, varying meal times, and the absence of any reliable clock. The sealed windows prevented him from tracking the sun's movement, and the artificial lighting could be adjusted to suggest morning or evening regardless of the actual time. It was a classic interrogation technique, Michael realized. Disorient the subject, remove their ability to ground themselves temporally, and they become more pliable, more prone to mistakes and inconsistencies. But knowing the technique didn't make it any less effective. By what he guessed was the 3rd day, though it could have been the 4th or even 5th, Michael found himself losing track of whether he'd already answered certain questions or just thought about answering them. The interrogations themselves were nothing like what he'd imagined based on movies and thriller novels. There was no bright light in his eyes, no good cop and bad cop routine, no violence or threats of violence. Instead, Katerina would sit with him in the comfortable parlor, sometimes joined by another operative, a younger man named Yuri, who appeared to be her colleague or protege, and they would simply talk. They would discuss his childhood in Cedar Rapids, and Katerina would ask about his father's work at the local power company, and Michael would answer, not seeing the harm in such innocent biographical details. But then, seamlessly, the conversation would shift to Michael's education in electrical engineering, and from there to his early work in telecommunications. And suddenly they were discussing technical specifications that didn't seem important, until Katerina would ask a follow-up question that revealed just how much strategic value his seemingly mundane knowledge actually held. When you installed the communication system at the research facility outside Salzburg last year, Katerina said during one such session, you mentioned there were security concerns about the cable routing. What specifically concerned the facility managers? Michael had mentioned the Salzburg job almost in passing days earlier, or what felt like days earlier, when discussing his general work history. He'd thought nothing of it. Now suddenly it was being revisited with laser focus. "Just standard stuff," Michael said, trying to remember the details while simultaneously questioning whether he should be answering at all. They were worried about physical access points, where someone could potentially tap into the system. "And how did you address those concerns?" "We used armored conduit in sensitive areas and installed tamper detection on the main junction boxes." "Which areas were considered sensitive?" And there it was, the real question. Not about cable routing or security in general, but specific intelligence about which parts of a research facility conducting work for NATO were considered high value enough to warrant extra security measures. Michael was providing a map of priorities, highlighting exactly where an adversary should focus their attention. "I don't remember the specific areas," Michael lied, but he saw Katerina's slight smile and knew she recognized the lie. She didn't push, not yet. Instead, she shifted to another topic, letting that question hang in the air unresolved. A loose thread she could return to later, when he was more tired, more disoriented, more willing to fill in the gaps just to show he was cooperating. Thomas had warned him about this technique during one of their supervised interactions. "She'll ask the same question 17 different ways over several days," Thomas had said quietly, while Katerina was out of the room. "You'll forget which version you answered and how you answered it. Then she'll point out the inconsistencies and make you feel like you're failing at cooperation, even when you're trying to cooperate. It's exhausting. The only way to survive is to tell the truth completely and consistently, so there are no contradictions to catch." But Michael didn't want to tell the truth. He didn't want to betray the facilities he'd worked in, the people who had trusted him, the country that he still, despite everything, felt loyalty toward. Yet he also didn't want to end up like Dmitri, warehoused in that grey room, slowly losing himself to isolation and hopelessness. So he tried to walk a middle path, cooperating enough to avoid Dmitri's fate, while holding back enough to preserve some sense of integrity. It was an impossible balance, and he knew it was only a matter of time before he fell too far to one side or the other. On what Michael estimated was the 5th or 6th day, Katerina changed tactics. "I want to show you something," she said during their morning session, or what passed for morning in the timeless environment she'd created. She produced a file folder, thick with documents and photographs. "These are communications intercepts from the past 8 months, electronic intelligence gathered from facilities you worked in." Michael felt his stomach drop as she spread the materials across the coffee table. There were technical diagrams, signal analysis reports, transcripts of what appeared to be intercepted communications, all of it relating to sites where he'd installed or maintained telecommunications equipment. "You see, Mr. Harrison, whether you cooperate with us or not, we're already inside these systems. Your technical installations provided access points we've been exploiting for months. The only question is whether you help us understand what we are seeing and point us toward additional targets, or whether we continue this work without your input. Either way, the intelligence flows. Your cooperation doesn't determine whether we penetrate these facilities. That's already done. It only determines whether you live comfortably as our asset or uncomfortably as our prisoner." Michael stared at the documents, his mind racing. Was this true, or was it an elaborate bluff designed to make him feel like his resistance was pointless? The materials looked legitimate, but he had no way to verify them. For all he knew, this could be a sophisticated fabrication meant to break his resolve. "I don't believe you," Michael said, though his voice lacked conviction. Katerina's expression remained neutral. "Your belief is irrelevant. The facts exist whether you accept them or not. But if you need more convincing—" She pulled out another photograph, this one showing Michael himself, taken with a telephoto lens, working at a junction box inside what he recognized as the Salzburg facility. In the photo, he was clearly inside a restricted area, identifiable by the security markings on the walls. "We photographed you inside 17 different sensitive facilities over the past year," Katerina continued. "Sometimes our people were maintenance workers in adjacent buildings. Sometimes we had assets among the actual staff. You were never as isolated as you thought, Mr. Harrison. You were always being watched, always being documented. We know everything you did in those facilities, everyone you spoke with, every system you touched." The photograph shook Michael more than he wanted to admit. The idea that he'd been under surveillance for so long, that every job site had potentially been compromised, that his own work might have inadvertently created the vulnerabilities the KGB was now exploiting. It was overwhelming. "What do you want from me?" Michael asked again. But this time it wasn't a stalling question. It was genuine surrender. He needed to understand the full scope of what was being asked, to see the complete picture of how his life was being reshaped. Katerina gathered the photographs and documents, returning them to the folder with careful precision. First, complete documentation of every facility you've worked in over the past 3 years. Floor plans from memory, security protocols, personnel you interacted with, system specifications, anything and everything you can recall. Second, ongoing cooperation. You'll continue your work, but you'll create access points in new facilities. You'll gather information we specify. You'll report through channels we establish. Third, and most importantly, you'll live with the understanding that this relationship is permanent. We own you now, Mr. Harrison. We own you until you're no longer useful. And even then, we own your silence. And if I refuse? Then you join Dmitri in his room and we wait. A month, 6 months, a year, we're patient. Eventually everyone breaks. Some just require more time and more isolation than others. But they all break, Michael. They always do. She'd used his first name, Michael noticed, a subtle shift in the dynamics, creating false intimacy, making the oppressive relationship feel more personal and therefore harder to resist. It was manipulation, clearly and obviously manipulation, and yet it still affected him. Over the following days, he'd completely lost count now, it could have been a week or 2 weeks or longer, Michael began to talk. He told himself he was just providing information they probably already had, that he was holding back the truly damaging details, that he was cooperating enough to survive, but not enough to truly betray. But he knew he was lying to himself. Every technical schematic he drew from memory, every password protocol he explained, every vulnerability he identified was another brick in the fortress they were building around him. Thomas was released during this period. One morning he was simply gone, and when Michael asked Katerina about it, she smiled that neutral, professional smile and said Thomas had completed his obligations and been returned to his life. She showed Michael a photograph taken yesterday, or so she claimed, of Thomas sitting at a cafe in London, apparently free, apparently unharmed. "See," Katerina said, "I keep my promises. Cooperate fully, and you go home. It's that simple." But Michael noticed something in the photograph that chilled him. Thomas was sitting alone, but there was a newspaper on the table beside him, and its headline was clearly visible. Michael recognized it as a Soviet publication, something only someone looking specifically for it would notice. It was a message. Thomas was being watched. Even in London, even in freedom, the KGB had eyes on him. His release wasn't freedom, it was just a longer leash. Michael understood then the true nature of his situation. There would be no real escape from this. Whether he was in this house or back in Vienna or eventually returned to the United States, he would never be free of what was happening here. The KGB would own him, would watch him, would control him through fear and compromise for as long as he lived. The only question was how much of himself he'd preserve in the process. Late one evening, or what Katerina allowed him to believe was evening, Yuri joined one of their sessions. The younger operative had been present before, but mostly as an observer. This time he took a more active role, and Michael quickly realized why. Yuri was being trained. Katerina was teaching him her techniques, using Michael as the practical demonstration. "Notice how he hesitates before answering certain questions," Katerina said to Yuri, speaking about Michael as if he weren't there. "That hesitation indicates internal conflict. He's deciding what to reveal and what to withhold. When you see that, you know you've touched a sensitive area. The goal then is not to push directly, but to circle back later from a different angle when he's tired or distracted." Michael felt simultaneously humiliated and fascinated. He was watching his own interrogation from an outside perspective, seeing the techniques laid bare even as they were being used against him. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, and he was both the subject and an unwilling student. "What about the ones who resist completely?" Yuri asked, and Michael noticed the young man kept glancing toward the corridor that led to Dmitri's room. "Dmitri is an outlier," Katerina said. "Most people aren't capable of that level of sustained resistance. It requires either exceptional training or exceptional psychological damage. Dmitri has both. He was a Soviet citizen who turned traitor, which means he's betraying not just his country but his entire identity. His resistance is partly about protecting information and partly about maintaining the one shred of self-respect he has left. We'll break him eventually, but he's making it very expensive in terms of time and resources." "Should I be doing something different?" Michael asked suddenly, surprising himself with the question. He'd been silent during this tutorial session, but the clinical discussion of his own interrogation had sparked something. Anger, perhaps, or the absurd desire to at least understand the process that was destroying him. Katerina looked at him with what might have been respect. "You're doing exactly what I would expect from someone with your background and personality. You're cooperating enough to avoid extreme measures, but holding back enough to preserve your sense of integrity. It's a rational approach, very American in its pragmatism. The problem is that it's ultimately unsustainable. Eventually, you'll run out of partial truths to offer, and you'll face a choice: complete honesty or complete resistance. Most choose honesty. The few who choose resistance She gestured toward the corridor, toward Dmitri's room, making her point without words. "How long do I have?" Michael asked. "Before I reach that choice?" "Days, maybe a week," Katerina said. "You've provided valuable information, but you're approaching the limits of what partial cooperation can yield. Soon, I'll need everything, or I'll need to move you to more persuasive accommodations. The story is approaching its climax, and I need you to stay until the very end to discover what choice Michael ultimately makes and what becomes of him. If you've been watching until now, it means this story has resonated with you, and I deeply appreciate that. Please subscribe to our channel and hit that like button so you don't miss the incredible endings to stories like these. Drop a comment telling us whether you think Michael should have cooperated from the beginning or resisted until the end. Your engagement keeps these stories alive. Now let's discover together how this nightmare finally concludes." Michael never knew exactly what day it happened. Time had become so distorted in the house that when Katerina announced he was being released, his first reaction wasn't relief but suspicion. It had been at least 2 weeks, possibly 3, since he'd helped an elderly woman carry her groceries through the rain. He'd told Katerina most of what he knew, though he'd held back certain details about current projects, current contacts, information that felt too fresh and too dangerous to share. Was that enough? Or was this another psychological tactic, building him up only to tear him down more completely? "You've been cooperative, Mr. Harrison," Katerina said over breakfast. Their final breakfast together, apparently. "Not perfectly cooperative, but enough that I believe we can transition to the next phase of our relationship. You'll return to your life in Vienna, you'll continue your work, and periodically, we'll be in touch with specific requests for information or access. You'll comply with those requests, and in return, you'll have your freedom, such as it is." "Just like that?" Michael asked, unable to keep the skepticism from his voice. "You're just letting me go?" "We're releasing you into a different kind of captivity," Katerina corrected. "You're not free, Mr. Harrison. You'll never be free again. But you can choose between comfortable captivity, where you appear to live a normal life while serving our interests, or uncomfortable captivity, where you resist and suffer accordingly. Most people choose comfort. I suspect you will too." She was right, and they both knew it. Michael wasn't built for martyrdom. He wasn't brave enough to choose Dmitri's path of absolute resistance. He would cooperate, tell himself it was survival, and live with the shame of that compromise for however long he had left. "What about Dmitri?" Michael asked. "And the others?" "Dmitri continues his resistance," Katerina said with a slight shrug. "Eventually he'll either break or become irrelevant. The others are none of your concern. Your task now is to forget this house exists, forget what happened here, and remember only that you have new obligations. The Americans may approach you again, by the way. If they do, you'll maintain your cover as their asset. You'll feed them information we provide. a mix of truth and misdirection that serves our purposes. You'll become a double agent whether you think of yourself that way or not. An hour later, Michael stood on a street corner 3 blocks from the safe house, blinking in sunlight that felt impossibly bright after weeks under artificial lighting. Katerina had given him new clothes. His old ones had been taken, presumably to prevent any tracking devices or marks that might have been on them, and a wallet with his identification and some cash. She'd walked him to the door, wished him well with chilling sincerity, and sent him back into the world. The street looked exactly as he remembered it. People going about their business, cars navigating the narrow roads, the daily commerce of Vienna continuing obliviously. Michael felt disconnected from all of it, like a ghost observing life rather than participating in it. He walked for blocks expecting at any moment to be grabbed, returned to the house, told this was all another test. But nothing happened. He was actually free, or at least he was outside the house, which was as close to freedom as he would get. His apartment was exactly as he'd left it. No one had cleared it out as Katerina had threatened. His phone was still on the hook, his mail piling up in the box downstairs. It was as if he'd simply been away on an extended trip rather than imprisoned in a KGB safehouse for weeks. The normalcy of it was somehow more disturbing than if everything had been ransacked. Michael spent the first day just sitting in his apartment, staring at walls, unable to process what to do next. Should he contact the embassy? David Chen? But what would he tell them? That he'd been captured, interrogated and released. They'd never trust him again. They'd assume, correctly, that he'd been compromised. He might even face charges for providing information to a hostile intelligence service, even though he'd had no choice. Or should he just disappear? Change his name, leave Vienna, try to build a new life somewhere the KGB couldn't find him. But he knew that was fantasy. Katerina had made it clear they could reach him anywhere. The surveillance that had identified him in the first place would simply follow him wherever he went. On the second day, his phone rang. Michael stared at it for several rings before answering, his heart racing. "Michael, it's David. I've been trying to reach you for 3 weeks. Where have you been?" David Chen, his CIA contact, the man whose recruitment had started all of this. Michael's mind raced, trying to remember what Katerina had told him. Act normal, maintain cover. If they ask, you had a family emergency. Family emergency, Michael heard himself say, the lie coming surprisingly easily. My mother was ill. I had to fly back to the States suddenly. I'm sorry I didn't call, everything happened so fast. Is she all right? She's stable now. It was touch and go for a while. I'm glad to hear she's better, David said, and he sounded genuine. Michael felt a wave of guilt that surprised him. He was lying to this man, betraying him, feeding him false information at the direction of Soviet intelligence. When had that become who he was? Listen, I know you've just gotten back, but we need to meet, David continued. Things have been developing while you were away. There's a new project I'd like your input on. And so it began. Michael returned to his double life, except now he was doubled twice. An American asset who was actually a Soviet asset, pretending to still be an American asset. The complexity of the deception was exhausting. He met with David regularly, provided the information Katerina had instructed him to provide, and watched as the CIA officer dutifully recorded everything, never suspecting that his source had been compromised. But the paranoia never left. Michael saw watchers everywhere. The man reading a newspaper at the cafe might be KGB surveillance. The woman who smiled at him on the tram might be an operative checking on him. Every phone call could be monitored. Every letter could be opened and read. His apartment certainly contained listening devices, though he'd never found them despite careful searches. The worst part was not knowing if any of it was real, or if he was simply losing his mind. Maybe the KGB wasn't actually watching him. Maybe they'd extracted what they needed and moved on to other operations. But Katerina had said they owned him permanently, and he believed her. Even if he never heard from them directly again, the possibility of their presence was enough to control him. 3 months after his release, Michael received a package at his office. Inside was a single photograph taken recently based on his clothing and the season visible in the background. It showed him sitting at Café Sperl, his regular morning spot. There was no note, no message, just that photograph. The meaning was clear: we're still watching. We'll always be watching. 6 months after his release, Michael saw Thomas at a conference in Brussels. The British operative, former operative, current double agent. What was the right term anymore? Looked haggard, but functional, maintaining his cover. Their eyes met across the conference hall, and in that brief glance Michael saw everything he needed to know. Thomas was living the same nightmare, caught in the same web, surviving but not truly alive. They didn't speak. What was there to say? A year after his release, Michael was transferred back to the United States by his company. He thought maybe distance from Vienna would help, that being back on American soil would somehow break the spell. But the watching continued, or at least the sense of being watched continued. He couldn't tell anymore what was real surveillance and what was paranoia. It was only 15 years later, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, that Michael finally learned the full truth about the safe house. Files were declassified, Soviet archives were opened, and journalists began piecing together the history of Cold War intelligence operations. The house on that quiet Vienna street had operated continuously from 1962 to 1989. Over those 27 years, it had processed 134 Western intelligence assets. Some were low-level, like Michael. Others were highly placed officials with access to genuine secrets. All of them had been lured, trapped, interrogated, and either flipped or warehoused until they broke. Katerina was real. Her name was actually Ekaterina Volkov, and she was one of the KGB's most successful operatives, credited with personally turning over 40 Western agents during her career. She'd retired in 1987 and died of natural causes in Moscow in 2003, having never faced justice for her operations. Thomas Wright, Michael confirmed this through private investigation years later, had indeed been released and returned to London. He'd continued working for MI6 while feeding information to the Soviets for another 3 years before being caught in 1986. He'd served 7 years in prison for espionage and been released in 1993, living out his remaining years in obscurity before dying in 2011. Dmitry, Michael discovered, had never been released. The Soviet asset who'd been imprisoned in that grey room had died there in 1985, officially of natural causes, but likely from the psychological toll of extended isolation. His real name had been Dmitry Petrov, and he'd been passing American intelligence to the KGB for nearly a decade before being discovered by his own service. His resistance in that safe house had been the final act of a man who'd lost everything and had nothing left but his silence. And Michael. Michael had survived. He'd provided enough information to buy his freedom, but not enough to cause catastrophic damage, or so he told himself. He'd lived the rest of his career under the shadow of those weeks in Vienna, never quite sure if the information he'd provided had gotten anyone killed, never quite able to forget the look in Dmitry's eyes or the sound of that lock clicking shut behind him. He'd married eventually, had 2 children, built a life that looked normal from the outside, but he never told anyone about the safe house, not his wife, not his children, not the debriefers who'd eventually caught up with him in the mid-1990s when the full extent of Soviet penetration became clear. By then, the statute of limitations had passed, and his information was too old to prosecute. They'd filed his report away and moved on. Now in his 70s, living in a retirement community in Florida, Michael sometimes thought about that rainy afternoon in Vienna, about the elderly woman with the heavy groceries, about the choice to help that seemed so simple and ended up redefining his entire life. He'd learned several things in that safe house that stayed with him forever. The first was that ordinary kindness could be weaponized, that human decency could become a vulnerability in a world where everyone was playing games he hadn't even known existed. The second was that courage wasn't binary. You didn't choose once to be brave or cowardly and then live with that choice. Courage was something you chose or failed to choose every single day, in small moments and large ones, and most people failed far more often than they succeeded. But the third lesson, the one that haunted him most, was that freedom was far more fragile than anyone wanted to believe. You could lose it in a moment, in the time it took to step through a door with a kind intention, and once lost, you might never truly get it back. even if you spent the rest of your life appearing free to everyone who looked at you. Michael had walked out of that house in Vienna over 35 years ago, but in the ways that mattered most, he'd never really left. Part of him was still there, in that comfortable parlor with the lace curtains, listening to Katerina explain the economics of betrayal, understanding that his life had divided into before and after, and that nothing would ever be the same again. And on quiet nights, when sleep wouldn't come and memory was too strong to resist, Michael would wonder about the others, the 133 people who'd passed through that house before and after him. How many had survived? How many had retained any sense of who they'd been before? How many still woke up in the middle of the night, remembering the sound of a lock clicking shut? He would never know the answers, but he knew that somewhere scattered across the world there were others like him, others who'd learned that the Cold War wasn't just about nations and ideologies. It was about individual people making impossible choices in situations they never should have faced, trying to survive when survival itself was a form of defeat. Michael had survived. He'd lived. He'd even found moments of happiness in the decades that followed. But he'd never been free. And that, in the end, was exactly what Katerina had promised him. What an extraordinary journey we've taken together, through the shadows of Cold War espionage, where a simple act of kindness became a life-altering trap. Michael's story reminds us that the world of intelligence operations was never about glamorous action sequences or heroic escapes. It was about ordinary people, caught in extraordinary circumstances, forced to make choices that would define the rest of their lives. We want to hear from you. If you had been in Michael's position, would you have cooperated immediately to minimize the damage, or would you have resisted as long as possible on principle? Have you ever experienced a moment where your good intentions led you into unexpected danger? What do you think really happened to the others who passed through that house? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and please, tell us your name and what city and state you're watching from. We love knowing where our community is located and hearing your perspectives from different parts of the world. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think about the hidden costs of the Cold War, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you these incredible true stories of espionage, survival, and the extraordinary lives people lived in the shadows of history. Hit that bell notification so you never miss a story. And before you go, there's another incredible spy story waiting for you in the next recommended video appearing on your screen right now. Click it to continue this journey through the secret history that shaped our modern world. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and remember, the most dangerous traps are often the ones that look like simple kindness.